In March of 2010, NVIDIA showed up 6 months late to ATI's DirectX 11 party with the notorious GeForce GTX 480. It was poised to strike down ATI's Radeon HD 5870, and while the GTX 480 did take home a 10 to 15% performance advantage over the HD 5870, it came at the cost of tremendously higher power consumption over ATI's offering. Combine this with an inadequate reference cooler and the GTX 480 was a thermal nightmare, so much so that it became NVIDIA's laughingstock for years to come. However, 7 months later in November of 2010, NVIDIA released the GTX 480's well-refined successor, the GeForce GTX 580. Let's start off with the specs of this card. It's using the GF110 GPU, which has 512 shading units and is clocked at 772 MHz. Its VRAM configuration consists of 1.5 GB of GDDR5 clocked at a fast 1002 MHz, which is running on a wide 384-bit bus, making for a total memory bandwidth of 192 GB per second. Initially, the GTX 580 was a DirectX 11 only part, however it later went on to support DirectX 12, which is something I'll get into a little later. Along with this, we have OpenGL 4.6 support. These two things give this card a pretty good amount of longevity today, and as a result, a lot of applications will still make use of this card. The TDP was greatly improved over the GTX 480, being 244 watts rather than well over 280 watts. In order to fully understand the GTX 580's origin, we need to get into a bit of history on its predecessor, the GTX 480. And in order to do that, we have to take a step way back to September of 2009. NVIDIA had announced their Fermi GPUs, and from these initial announcements they showed that the highest end of these GPUs, GF100, was slated to be a 512 shading unit part. However, TSMC was not delivering expected yields on their 40nm process, which would end up hitting both ATI and NVIDIA pretty hard, but more so NVIDIA. The reason for this is because the Radeon HD 5870's Cypress GPU was much smaller than the GTX 480's GF100, meaning it was a lot easier to produce without defects. Now, that's not to say ATI wasn't having issues, as the dismal yields still caused the HD 5870 to be in low supply. In the case of the GTX 480 though, well, it was pretty much doomed to fail from the start. In order to stay competitive with ATI's offerings, NVIDIA had to produce a very large and complex GPU on an already low-yielding process. As a result, the GTX 480 was incredibly difficult for NVIDIA to make, so much so that GF100 actually had to be cut down in order to be a viable cell. As a result, they ended up with this cut-down GPU that never fully met expectations. That is until 7 months later, NVIDIA released the GTX 580, which used a refined and fully unlocked GF100, dubbed GF110. Let's get into the revisions NVIDIA made to the GF100 GPU. First of all, they greatly improved power leakage at the transistor level, meaning GF110 produced far less heat than its predecessor. Along with this came improvements to texture filtering speed per clock, as well as improved Z-culling for more efficient and as a result faster rendering. Next, they enabled the 16th SM, which granted access to an extra 32 shaders, bringing the shader count up to 512. Combine all of this with a 10% increase to core clocks and an 8% increase to memory clocks, and this resulted in a 15% performance improvement over the GTX 480, all while consuming quite a bit less power. As a result, the GTX 580 was quite a formidable card, and commonly regarded as what the GTX 480 should have been originally. Something worth mentioning here is that with Fermi, NVIDIA was betting on a more scalable, compute-based architecture, and it really showed in a lot of tests as upon its release, the GTX 480 was the fastest compute card available by quite a long shot. Now, being based on the same architecture, the GTX 580 inherits this excellent compute performance and is actually faster thanks to the revisions made to the silicon. Anyhow, this more flexible architecture eventually allowed the Fermi cards to support DirectX 12, which is actually pretty nice. It's not a high feature level, so compatibility is a bit spotty, but it's still nice to have on what is now an 11-year-old card. With the card's history out of the way, let's take a look at the card itself. I purchased this card online for $25 US, and it was kept in fantastic shape by the previous owner. There was practically no dust, and the card had no noticeable scuffs or scratches. It's in such good condition that I'm going to go on a limb here and say the card was seldom used throughout its life. If you couldn't already tell, this GTX 580 is made by Zotac. All it really is the reference card with some Zotac branding though. The aesthetic is pretty nice even though it's just a sticker. The reference GTX 580 looks a lot like the GTX 480 except without the copper grille and copper heat pipes sticking out. Overall, despite looking a little plain, I really like the look of this card. One thing that gave the GTX 580 a leg up over its predecessor was the cooling solution. Instead of using a heatsink with copper heat pipes leading to an aluminum fin stack, the GTX 580 used an amazing vapor chamber cooler, which kept this card pretty cool and in general was a huge step up over the GTX 480. Getting the heatsink off the card was a struggle as the old paste was holding it on like glue. After a long scuffle with the heatsink off camera, I finally got it off and revealed the dry old paste. Its consistency was akin to that of Play-Doh and took a good amount of cleaning to get all of it off. With the old paste off, take a look at that massive heat spreader. Unlike today's GPUs, these older NVIDIA cards used an IHS, which is kind of strange to see on a GPU. Anyway, I followed up with a P of Arctic MX4 and the card was ready to go. The change helped quite a bit as temps dropped by 7 degrees at load. So now that the card is ready to go, it's time to test it out. As usual, we're going to throw in some overclocked results as well. So using MSI Afterburner, I was able to overclock the card to the tune of 900 MHz on core and 1125 MHz on memory. That represents a 17% increase to core frequencies from stock and a 12% increase to memory frequencies. In order to hit these speeds, I did have to increase the core voltages to 1125 mV, which is 87 mV over stock. As to be expected though, the card ran much hotter with the overclock, and I had to max out the fan speed in order to see reasonable temps. I'll say, it's really loud at these speeds. The card isn't getting nearly hot enough to thermal throttle, so the performance seen here should be correct. Alright then, time to see how this thing stacks up. Test system specs are on screen. All footage was recorded on an external capture device, so there should be no hit to performance. Let's see how this Fermi beast holds up in some games. First up is Phasmophobia, and with the 1080p resolution and the medium settings with 25% texture resolution, the card managed 81 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 37. When overclocked, averages rose 14% to 92 FPS, with 1% lows rising 16% to 43. The game ran well and looked pretty good too. I did have to turn down textures, otherwise our 1.5 GB of VRAM would become fully saturated and cause stutter. Considering the age of the card, I was quite impressed here. Next game is CSGO, and with the 720p resolution and the low settings with shadow set to high, the card achieved averages of 216 FPS, with 1% lows down to 90. When overclocked, averages rose 5% to 227 FPS, with 1% lows rising 3% to 94. Frame times were pretty good and overall the card offered a very competitive experience. Project Cars 3 is next, and in 1080p with the low settings, the card managed 46 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 38. When overclocked, averages rose 15% to 53 FPS, with 1% lows rising 16% to 44. Frame times were excellent and it was a great experience all in all. As to be expected, the card's VRAM was pretty much fully utilized here. Next up is Minecraft. I ran the game with the 1080p resolution and the fancy settings, along with Optifine and BSL shaders enabled using the low preset. The card achieved averages of 48 FPS, with 1% lows down to 35. When overclocked, averages rose 10% to 53 FPS, with 1% lows rising 9% to 38. The game looked great and played pretty well. GPU utilization was very good, which is uncommon for Minecraft even with shaders. Next game is Sniper Ghost Warrior 3, and with the 1080p resolution and the low settings, the card got an average frame rate of 31 FPS, with 1% lows down to 25. When overclocked, averages rose 13% to 35 FPS, with 1% lows rising 8% to 27. Frame times were pretty consistent overall, which made for an experience akin to a last-gen console. Not a bad showing for an 11-year-old card. Tomb Raider is up next. I used the built-in benchmark, and with the 1080p resolution and the ultra settings, the card got an average frame rate of 68 FPS with 1% lows down to 56. When overclocked, averages rose 13% to 77 FPS, with 1% lows rising 11% to 62. The game looked fantastic and played really well thanks to the wonderful frame times. Next is 2007's PC killer, Crysis. I ran the built-in benchmark in 1080p with a very high preset with no AA. The card got averages of 55 FPS, with 1% lows down to 43. When overclocked, averages rose 13% to 62 FPS, with 1% lows rising 12% to 48. I'll say I was impressed with the frame times, and as to be expected, the game looked really nice at this resolution and settings. Finally, we have Just Cause 2, and I ran the Dark Tower benchmark in 1080p with the high preset. The card managed an average frame rate of 91 FPS, with 1% lows down to 66. When overclocked, averages rose 13% to 103 FPS, with 1% lows rising 17% to 77. The game ran really well thanks to the nice frame times and looked great despite being an older title. So, the conclusion. As you saw in the benchmarks, the GTX 580 is a very impressive performer considering it's well over a decade old. I would happily use it in 2022, even if it may not be able to launch a majority of DirectX 12 titles. More importantly though, does the GTX 580 redeem its furnace oven predecessor, the GTX 480? I'd say yes it does. Although architecturally the GTX 580 is virtually the same as its predecessor, the refinements made to it make a pretty huge difference, especially when it comes to power consumption. The sizable boost in performance is also very welcome. Overall, the GTX 580 greatly represents the refinements made to the Fermi architecture, which would actually pave the way for NVIDIA's Kepler cards like the GTX 680. That's a video for another day though. Anyhow, that'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.